Many have mused as to why no contenders from the Democratic Party appeared to challenge Joe Biden in the primaries for the nomination, or at least very few contenders. While conventional wisdom may cede to the incumbent, nothing is conventional about this year's election, especially the age of the sitting president. With us today is the Lever's David Sirota, who has examined why the Democratic Party blocked challengers to Biden and why the DNC has now become hostile to any dissent within its ranks. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
All right, what's been going on here? Because in this piece, you examine a lot of smaller, I would say, like lower level instances of Democratic blockage, right down to this instance, which I had forgotten about, where a Democratic candidate in Michigan was offered $20 million to drop out of his current race and run against Rashida Tlaib. What's going on here?
Well, look, I think overall the culture of the Democratic Party has shifted to one that is explicitly hostile to primary contests in general across the board. I mean, this is a party that had vigorous primary contests all the way up, as far as I look at it, until 2008. I mean, people tend to forget that the 2008 presidential contest, it was supposed to be kind of a coronation for Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama ran a really tough primary against her, and she ran a tough primary against him, and this was considered all part of normal politics. This is no longer considered really a normal part of Democratic Party politics. That primary challenges up and down the ballot are not seen as something that strengthen potential general election nominees, but they are instead looked at as things that weaken candidates that should be avoided because it's a display of a back and forth fight over ideas, which supposedly weakens the party. I tend to see it the other way. I guess that makes me kind of old school, that I think that primaries are the thing that battle test your candidates before they become the general election nominee. But that culture has been kind of wrung out of the Democratic Party. And the problem is, when it comes to the presidential election, you now ended up with you've ended up with a nominee who didn't go through a tough primary, Joe Biden, who didn't really have to articulate much of a sharp political message for the last few years here, who is now the nominee, who is very unpopular and who is having to play a lot of catch up on some of the issues that he could have been sharpening himself on when it comes to politics and the election. Could have been sharpening that message, but that didn't happen because there was no primary. There was no real primary.
What do you say to Democrats who say, well, this is just because Biden is the incumbent, there's not going to be a primary this time? If there was no incumbent president, then we would have a real contest, but there wasn't a real primary, a movement against Barack Obama when he ran for re-election, that's really the issue. What's your response to that?
Well, look, you could certainly make that argument if the incumbent was relatively popular. But if we look back on the last 30, 40, 50 years of history, oftentimes when incumbent presidents are as unpopular as Joe Biden is in the polls, and we can discuss whether it's fair that he's that unpopular, but as a matter of fact, he is unpopular in public opinion surveys, that in the past, incumbents like that have faced vigorous primary challenges. I mean, Eugene McCarthy ran a vigorous primary contest against Lyndon Johnson. Ronald Reagan ran a very tough primary against Gerald Ford, who was very unpopular in 1976. Ted Kennedy ran a primary challenge against Jimmy Carter. Pat Buchanan ran a primary challenge against George H.W. Bush. So the point is that it's in some ways ahistorical that a president who is as unpopular as Joe Biden did not face a serious primary contest. And I think we have to ask ourselves, well, if it's ahistorical, then what really has changed? And I think that basically Democratic Party leaders and Democratic Party aligned media have done a very good job of selling rank and file Democratic voters on the idea that primaries should be looked at as a form of sedition and apostasy fantasy, something disgusting and terrible, rather than part of the small d democratic process.
David, I can see some listeners look at the examples that you offered and say, well, those incumbents that had primary challenges against them didn't fare so well, and so maybe we should protect Biden against that from that eventuality. However, another way to read that is to say those incumbents got meaningful primary challenges because they were already showing a vulnerability. And perhaps if the political environment were more realistic about the need to sub in someone who could potentially be stronger, then there might have been a better outcome for the party in those instances. I mean, how are you reading this, and what do you think that Joe Biden's most significant vulnerabilities are that could potentially have been shored up by a primary contest or by a different candidate in particular? I know that you talked somewhat about Newsom kind of flirting with the candidacy in a kind of a shadow primary this year.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to run back the counterfactuals, right? Did those incumbents lose because they were already weak, and that's why they got a primary challenge? Or did they lose because they got a primary challenge? I mean, I don't think it's the latter. I don't think those incumbents lost their bids for re-election because they faced a primary. And again, I go back to 2008, right? 2008 was a vicious primary, right? Obama and Clinton really, really vilified each other. And I don't think that weakened the eventual general election nominee. Just like I don't think Bill Clinton in the 1992 primary was weakened by the very tough back and forth in that race. So I don't really buy that, but I guess nobody can really approve which way is the other. You have to run history back. But I would say this on your question about what Biden might have faced in a primary. I think Biden might have been forced to sharpen his economic message in the way that you saw him sharpen it in the State of the Union. Look, I thought the recent State of the Union address was a very good speech by Biden, an economic message that was strong. He has a decent economic story to tell about his specific policies and about how the macroeconomy is better than it could be. He has a story to tell. He hasn't really had to tell it. Now, you could argue that perhaps he can't tell it, that he's just not a good enough politician, or he's an 81-year-old guy who's lost some skills. You could argue that, but the way to find that out, if you're a Democrat, where you'd want to find that out, is in the primary, where there's a potential replacement candidate if the potential incumbent cannot sell that message inside of his own party. But because there wasn't that primary contest, a really contested primary, now we're in a general election situation where if you are a Democrat and you want the Democrats to win, and you don't want Donald Trump to be president, now you're stuck with a nominee who really wasn't tested.
Let me ask you this, David. Do you think that there's any chance, as some have speculated, there was a big Ezra Klein story about this maybe a month or so back now, that there could be a swapping out at the convention of who the Democratic candidate is? And if so, I mean, I wonder if you have any speculation about who a replacement for Joe Biden could or should be in that instance.
It's hard for me to imagine Democratic Party culture, and I want to really hone in on that for a second. What we've been talking about, it's hard for me to imagine that Democratic Party culture, which has become a culture, a top-down culture, which has been Democratic rank and file, especially activists, have been sold on the idea that the party elders, the party bosses, the party elites choose nominees, and challenging them, questioning them, really pushing them on anything is bad. It's hard for me to believe that out of that process comes a convention in which there's a new nominee. Now, of course, Biden could say, I'm not going to run again. I guess he could say that, and there would be that process. And look, I think there are plenty of very strong and well-positioned Democratic candidates to run for president, some of whom I agree with, some of whom I don't agree with on all of the issues, right? Forgetting about are they conservative Democrats, progressive Democrats, or the like. I mean, you've got governors in Pennsylvania, you've got governor in Michigan, you've got a governor in, I think, Washington State, Jay Inslee, who I think is very good on climate, for instance. I think you've got Ro Khanna, who is a House member. The list, it's a long list. Gavin Newsom, you mentioned, right? I mean, there's a long list, and I'm not saying I agree with all of them or any of them, et cetera, et cetera. My point is there are potentially strong candidates there, but it's hard for me to imagine that a convention process even allows for that kind of debate. I mean, it's just not the culture of the Democratic Party. It's not a very small d Democratic culture.
And can you speak maybe briefly to an issue that we've talked about in some other segments today, which is that the kind of legal efforts that the Democratic Party has undertaken to restrict ballot access for third-party candidates, be they Green Party candidates like Jill Stein or independent candidates like RFK Jr.?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the classic case of both parties. This is really the characteristic of what's called the duopoly, that the duopoly doesn't want to make it easier for challengers to run outside of the duopoly's own system. I mean, that is a basic self-interest on the part of both parties. So it's not surprising. It's something that we should expect from both major parties. They are the monopoly or the duopoly, so they're trying to protect their market share. I think ultimately, though, the dissent is going to go somewhere. And this is a really important point, that you can suppress dissent and you can be successful in the short term at suppressing dissent. In the Democratic Party, for instance, you can cancel primaries, you can make ballot access harder, you can change the rules to kind of front load primaries. You can do all that. And in the short term, the dissent suppression probably can work at some level. But over the long haul, that dissent is going to go somewhere. And the problem with not having a contested primary where that dissent can at least be expressed is now you run the risk of having that dissent expressed in a general election arena in which the expression of that dissent in outside of the two parties could end up boosting somebody like Donald Trump. Now, I'm not making a value judgment on how people vote. Like, people have to choose how they want to vote in a general election. That's their choice. There's different logics. There's different arguments on both sides. But the point is, if you, as a party, suppress dissent in your own intra-party arenas, primaries, then you're running the risk of that dissent going somewhere else in a general election.
Wise words of wisdom that the Democratic Party should perhaps listen to. Not sure that they will. Thank you so much for joining us today, David Sirota. And can you tell us a little bit where people can find you at The Lever?
Yes, find us at levernews.com and subscribe to our new podcast, levertimepod.com.
All right, thanks, David. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.